September 2023 on the Ohio River, a team of volunteer divers pops up to the surface, and the lead diver signals back to the boat. They'd found something huge. The sonar had given them an inkling, but the shape that lay a staggering 30 feet beneath the water, buried in mud and darkness for over 2 decades, sealed it. Some of you may have never been born when this thing first went under. They go back down, cameras running, even though the visibility is practically zero. And as they get close enough to make out what they're looking at, the truth hits hard. It's a vehicle, a blue Honda CR-V, and it's been sitting down there for 23 long years. But here's the thing, finding the car was only the beginning, because what followed didn't just reopen an old case, it tore the quiet heart out of a peaceful Ohio neighborhood and revealed a truth so twisted, so unsettling, that even seasoned investigators struggled to wrap their minds around it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a wrong turn in a snowstorm. This was murder. Cold, calculated, intentional. And who could that person be? Somebody whom the family trusted, somebody the community trusted, somebody who joined in the search for Katie, consoled her grieving mother, looked this family in the eye for more than 2 decades while harboring the darkest secret you can imagine. Then, let's go back to the beginning. December 15th, 2000. Katie Hart's 25-year-old accountant, daughter and sister was just trying to make her way home through one of the worst blizzards Ohio had seen in years. She called her mom at 10:18 p.m. to say she'd be home soon. Just 9 minutes later, a bridge camera caught her blue CR-V passing by, barely visible through the pounding snow, with headlights slicing through the storm. And then, nothing. No wreckage, no tracks, no body, just gone. Her mother, Carmen, kept the porch light on for 23 straight years, not missing one night. And in those same years, her brother Miguel searched, asking questions and pushing anyone who would listen. He had always believed that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. And he was right, because in September of 2023, divers pulled that CR-V from the river, with Katie still inside. Her ID remained intact, and the evidence told a story no family should ever have to hear. Skull trauma, a cut seatbelt, DNA, phone records, a hidden knife found years later in a basement, and finally an arrest that shook Snow Road, Ohio to its core. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We cover cases exactly like this every week, and you don't want to miss where this story goes next. It's the kind of case that stays with you long after the screen goes dark, a reminder of just how fragile trust can be. And hey, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. Now, Snow Road, Ohio, if you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Most people haven't. It's one of those small, working-class neighborhoods on the edge of a mid-sized town where everyone still knows everyone. It's the kind of place where you keep your front door unlocked because, well, why wouldn't you? Kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on. Neighbors swap sugar, then return the container filled with homemade cookies. There's a block party every summer without fail. December 2000 was full of that usual holiday cheer. Christmas lights on the porches, inflatable Santas wobbling in front yards, people juggling shopping lists and year-end deadlines. But then that year, winter came in fast, and it came in mean. Temperatures plummeted into the teens. Snow piled up faster than the plows could keep up. And by December 15th, the National Weather Service had blizzard warnings stretched across the entire region. By that evening, visibility was virtually zero. The roads were slick, icy, and dangerous. Anyone with any sense stayed off them. But not everyone gets to choose. Katie's day had started like any other. At her desk by 8:30 a.m., she was deep in year-end reports, double-checking numbers, tying up loose ends. Co-workers remembered her as focused but in good spirits. She even mentioned wanting to leave early because of the storm. Katie didn't want to get stuck driving home in the worst of the storm. She started wrapping things up for the day by around 6 p.m., slipping her coat on, saying a good night to the handful of co-workers still around, and heading out into the cold. Snow was falling fast and heavy already. She brushed the ice off her windshield, started up her blue Honda CR-V, and eased out of the parking lot. She stopped at the grocery store on her way home. The security footage at 7:42 p.m. shows her grabbing the essentials: Milk, bread, eggs, everyday stuff. She paid cash, flashed a friendly smile at the cashier, and walked out. No one knew then, but it would be one of the very last confirmed moments of her life. From there, she should have gone straight home. Under normal conditions, the drive would have taken 15 minutes. But these weren't normal conditions. The plows were overwhelmed, traffic was crawling, and somewhere along that route, something changed. Maybe she made a decision, or maybe someone else made it for her. She called her mother at 10:18 p.m. Carmen answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom! Katie, where are you?" "I've been worried sick. The roads are terrible." I know. I'm fine. I'm almost home. I'll be there soon. Love you." "Love you too, baby. Drive safe." That was it. 20, maybe 30 seconds. Short and simple. But Carmen would replay those words for the next 23 years, picking apart every tone, every breath, any hint that something was wrong. But there wasn't anything. Katie had sounded normal. Maybe tired but calm, not frightened. Just 9 minutes later, at 10:27 p.m., a traffic camera on the Route 7 bridge caught a blurry glimpse of a blue Honda CR-V. The snow was falling so hard you could barely see the shape of the vehicle. No license plate, no view of the driver. Just a pair of headlights cutting through the storm and then vanishing into the white. That was the last known sighting of Katie Hart's. Carmen wasn't one to panic easily. Still, by 11:30 p.m., she was pacing the house. With a blizzard, Katie really should have been home by then. She tried calling her daughter. It rang and then went straight to voicemail. She called again. Same thing. By midnight, Carmen called her son. "Miguel, have you heard from your sister?" "Not since this afternoon. Why?" "She's not home. She called me over an hour ago and said she was almost here. I can't reach her." Miguel tried calling too. No answer. He told his mom to stay put and that he'd go look for her. He pulled on his coat, climbed into his truck, and drove out into the storm. Visibility was almost non-existent. He said later he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He drove the route Katie would have taken, slowly, eyes scanning the snowbanks and ditches for tire tracks. Debris, anything. Nothing. He looked at the grocery store, empty. He drove past her apartment. The car wasn't there. He called hospitals. No unidentified women, no crash victims matching her description. No reports of a blue CR-V in an accident. By 2:47 a.m., Miguel was back at his mother's house. Carmen was already on the phone with police. "I need to report a missing person. My daughter. She should have been home hours ago. She's not answering her phone. Something's wrong." The dispatcher took all of the details. Katie's age, description, her car, where she'd last been seen. They reminded Carmen that in storms like this, people sometimes pull over somewhere safe. Sometimes cell service drops. Maybe she'd show up any moment. But Carmen knew better. Mothers always do. Katie wasn't coming home. By the time the sun rose on December 16th, the storm had somewhat subsided. It was still snowing, but gently now. Visibility went from impossible to just difficult. That is when the real search began. The Ohio State Highway Patrol coordinated with local police. Search and rescue teams were called in. Volunteers poured out. Neighbors, co-workers, even people who'd never met Katie, but heard she was missing. Because in a place like Snow Road, when someone disappears, you show up. That's just what people do. They started with the route from the grocery store to Katie's apartment. They checked everything, every side street, every parking lot, every ditch along the highway. Officers walked the shoulders of Route 7 in the freezing cold, looking for skid marks, tire tracks, even a stray piece of debris, anything that suggested Katie had gone off the road. Tow trucks pulled out stranded cars one by one, just in case one of them was hers. Nothing. Search dogs were brought in, German shepherds trained to work even in the harshest conditions. They zeroed in on the bridge where that blurry traffic camera had picked up what could have been Katie's CR-V. The dogs alerted on a few spots, but each lead fizzled out. No clothing, no personal belongings, no hint of Katie. When the weather finally cooperated, helicopters took to the skies. Thermal imaging cameras scanned miles of fields, wooded areas, and riverbanks, looking for a heat signature. Perhaps a vehicle under the snow, maybe. Anything. Still nothing. Frame by frame, investigators pored over the images captured by the bridge camera, trying to squeeze every pixel for answers. They tried enhancing the image in hopes of seeing the license plate or even a silhouette of someone inside the car. But this was the year 2000. The snow was too heavy, and the technology just couldn't cut through. They could only confirm one thing: a blue SUV matching Katie's CRV headed east at 10:27 p.m. But then, where did it go? Days turned into weeks. The search area expanded. Neighboring counties were notified. Katie's details entered the National Crime Information Center. Her picture swept through police departments statewide and into neighboring states. Flyers showed up everywhere: telephone poles, gas stations, interstate rest stops. Missing: Katie Hart, 25. Last seen December 15th, 2000. Her face stared back smiling, hopeful, so heartbreakingly alive. But as December became January and January became February, the search teams thinned out. Volunteers had jobs to get back to. News crews found other stories. The world moved on, except for the Hart's family. They were left with a quiet so heavy it felt like sinking. Detectives pushed forward. They interviewed everybody: co-workers, friends, ex-boyfriends, and family. They recreated her final hours, dug into her phone records, bank activity, credit card statements, each piece of modern life that might yield a breadcrumb. But nothing pointed anywhere. Katie did not have any debt. She was not into any hazardous activity. She had no history of mental health issues. She wasn't running away from anything or anyone. Her bank account was never touched after December 15th. Her credit cards remained silent. Her phone pinged one final time at 10:26 p.m. near the Route 7 bridge, and then stopped. Friends said she was steady, grounded, and genuinely happy. She'd talked about taking a vacation in the spring. She'd even been thinking about adopting a cat. That's not someone preparing to disappear? Her ex-boyfriend from 2 years earlier? He was out of state visiting family. Phone records and receipts backed him up completely. Co-workers were cleared, no disputes, no jealousy, nothing unusual. And her family? Investigators ruled them out almost immediately. Carmen and Miguel were shattered, cooperative, and desperate. There was no motive, no opportunity, and absolutely no reason to suspect them. The question hung in the air. The working theory was simple, almost too simple. Investigators thought she'd had an accident, that the blizzard caused her to lose control, sending her off the road, maybe into the Ohio River, maybe into a ravine, maybe into a field where the snow had buried the car so deeply search teams didn't stand a chance. It was the only theory that fit, except it didn't. Katie was a cautious driver. She knew how to handle winter roads. And even if she slid off the highway, even if something sudden happened, one thing still didn't make sense. Search teams combed the Ohio River using sonar in the weeks after her disappearance, with divers going down near the bridge. And yet they found nothing. Divers found all kinds of junk in the river: old tires, shopping carts, even a rusted-out truck from the 1980s. But not a single sign of a blue Honda CRV. By spring of 2001, the case was technically still open, but the urgency had faded. Detectives were pulled onto newer cases. Katie's file moved from a desk to a cabinet and eventually into a storage room filled with hundreds of other unsolved cases. And just like that, Katie Hart's became another statistic, another missing person, another cold file waiting for a break that never seemed to come. But one man did stand out in those early days, and he seemed especially eager to help. He was 42 back in December 2000 and lived just 3 doors down from Carmen on Snow Road. He'd been part of the neighborhood for years, a quiet, polite man, the type who kept his lawn tidy, shoveled his driveway before sunup, and always gave a friendly wave when you drove by. He'd known Katie since she was a teenager. Was he close to the family? Not exactly, but he was neighborly. He'd helped Carmen fix a leaky faucet once, lent Miguel jumper cables when his truck died. Just everyday acts of kindness. So when Katie disappeared, Richard did what any good neighbor would do. He showed up. He joined the search teams. He walked the blocks with flyers. He knocked on doors asking questions. He brought Carmen coffee and reassured her, We'll find her. Don't give up, and everyone appreciated it, Carmen and Miguel and the whole neighborhood. Because that is what community looks like at the darkest hour. People showing up, people helping each other. When detectives canvassed Snow Road, Richard was fully cooperative. Polite, open, calm. He told them he'd been home the night Katie vanished. The blizzard was bad and he stayed in, watched TV, went to bed at around 11. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Did he know Katie? Sure, sweet girl. Lived down the street. Did he have any idea where she might be? Number. He was just hoping she was all right, hoping she'd be found soon. Detectives thanked him and moved along. Why wouldn't they? Richard Hale was just a neighbor, a helpful, concerned neighbor. And that's precisely the image he wanted them to see. Because Richard Hale had a secret, one he managed to bury for 23 years. A secret that only began to crack open when a group of volunteer divers pulled a blue Honda CRV out of the Ohio River. And forensic investigators started asking questions Richard couldn't quite answer. But back in December 2000, no one suspected him. Not even a little. Why would they? He fit right in. Before we get any further, quick question. What time is it for you right now? Late night deep dive or early morning binge? Let me know, because what comes next shows just how long a lie can survive when the person telling it knows exactly how to disappear into the background. For Carmen Hartz, every day after December 15th felt like drowning. She'd wake up each morning, and for one brief, painful second, before her mind fully caught up, she'd forget. And then reality would crash back in. Katie was gone. She kept the porch light on every single night. It became more than a habit. It became a promise. As long as that light glowed, Katie could find her way home. Police had moved on. Yet it didn't matter. It didn't matter that the searches had stopped. It didn't even matter that the neighbors had begun to whisper gently that maybe it was time to face the reality. Carmen refused. She kept Katie's room precisely the same. The bed made, the closet filled with clothes, photos still on the dresser, untouched, unmoved. Friends said that packing things away might bring her some peace, might help her begin healing. But Carmen couldn't. She wouldn't. Letting go felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, Miguel grieved differently, but his ache was just as profound. He couldn't sit still, couldn't accept the questions that would never be answered. He read every police report he was allowed to see. He threw himself into the search the only way he knew how, by trying to organize chaos, building spreadsheets, timelines, even little maps marking every tip the police ever passed along. Every few months, he'd call the detective on the case, hoping for even one small update. But the answer was always the same. No news, no leads, nothing. He tried hiring private investigators, but they couldn't uncover anything the police hadn't already done. He joined early internet forums dedicated to missing persons, connecting with families who were living the same slow-burning nightmare. They shared theories, resources, and hope. But hope without answers can feel a lot like slow-motion heartbreak. Miguel tried to live a normal life, truly. He went on dates, but somewhere between the salad and the entree, he'd find himself talking about Katie. He'd start a new job, and within a few weeks, everyone knew his sister's story. He kept flyers in his glove compartment for years, just in case. Just in case he spotted someone who looked like her. Just in case he found a bulletin board that needed one more missing person poster. They urged him to seek therapy. He did, a few times. He sat across from a gentle counselor who used words like closure and moving forward. But how do you move forward when your story has no ending? How do you accept something your heart refuses to believe? The anniversaries were brutal. Every December 15th, the local news might run a short segment, still no answers in disappearance of Katie Hartz. Carmen and Miguel would sit in front of a camera once again, asking the public for help, offering a reward they honestly couldn't afford. Tips would trickle in. A woman who looked like Katie at a truck stop in Pennsylvania, a car resembling hers in a Kentucky junkyard. Every tip was checked. None went anywhere. By 2005, the case had gone beyond cold. The original detective had retired, and the new one had a stack of older, equally impossible cases. Katie's file kept growing, but not with solutions, just more dead ends. The year 2010 finally came, and a whole decade had slipped away. Carmen looked older. Her face carried the weight of years spent waiting. Still, she would turn on the porch light every night. She kept Katie's room in the same condition as it was, yet hope was still there, but now it looked more like a flicker than a flame. Miguel tried to build a life. He even got married, but the marriage didn't last. His wife said he was never fully present. That part of him always felt far away. She wasn't wrong. He carried a quiet guilt with him everywhere. Guilt for laughing when he didn't know if Katie could laugh too. Guilt for enjoying a meal when he didn't know if she'd ever had another one. Guilt for living when she still might be out there somewhere. By 2015, 15 years after Katie vanished, the neighborhood had changed. Kids who had been toddlers in 2000 were teenagers who barely knew the story. New families moved in. Life moved forward, the way it always does, whether you're ready or not. But Carmen and Miguel didn't move forward. Not really. Meanwhile, Richard Hale still lived 3 doors down. Still quiet, still polite, still the good neighbor. He'd check in on Carmen from time to time, just enough to appear kind. He'd say he still thought about Katie, still hoped for answers, and Carmen appreciated that. It meant something to know someone else remembered. She had no idea. The world had changed dramatically by 2020. Technology had leaped forward. Social media was a force of nature now. Cold cases were solved with tools original investigators could only dream about. Once limited, DNA evidence had become powerful. Genetic genealogy was cracking cases frozen for decades. Miguel followed every story he could find. He read about the Golden State Killer, caught because of distant relatives in a genealogy database. He read about unidentified victims being named 30 or 40 years later. He read about volunteer dive teams pulling cars out of lakes and rivers with sonar equipment far superior to anything local police had. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of real hope. A what-if question lingered in Miguel's mind. What if the new technology could find something the old searches missed? What if Katie's car was there all along, just waiting for someone with the right tools? So he began to reach out. He contacted numerous volunteer groups, mailing emails and making phone calls, telling Katie's story over and over. He explained the theory that she might have gone into the Ohio River and reminded them that early searches back in 2000 and 2001 didn't have today's sonar or experienced volunteer dive teams. Most groups were overwhelmed, and they would have hundreds, sometimes thousands of cases waiting. They would put Katie's name on the list, but it might be years before anyone could take a look. Miguel comprehended. The waiting itself had become a kind of lifestyle for him. Meanwhile, Carmen's health was slipping. Decades of stress and sleepless nights finally caught up to her. She suffered a heart attack back in 2021. She survived, but just barely. The doctors said she needed less stress. Miguel almost wished they'd given her instructions on how to turn water into wine instead. Because how do you reduce stress when your daughter has been missing for more than 2 decades? Yet every night, she would turn that porch light on. Then in the summer of 2023, Miguel's phone rang. The caller ID showed a name he didn't recognize. The group was called Hope in Depth, a volunteer dive team that searched bodies of water for long-missing people. They'd been working their way through old Ohio cold cases, and Katie's name had surfaced. They wanted to search a stretch of the Ohio River near the Route 7 bridge, the same area seen in that grainy 2000 traffic camera clip. Yes, it had been searched before, but the technology they use now, it wasn't even in the same universe as what existed back then. They couldn't promise anything, but they wanted to try. Miguel didn't hesitate. He said yes, but he didn't tell his mother right away. She'd had her heart broken too many times. He couldn't bear the thought of raising her hopes only to watch them collapse again. So he waited, he prayed, and he tried to prepare himself for whatever came next. Little did he know, the truth was closer than he'd ever imagined, and far darker than he'd ever wished. Hope in Depth wasn't a typical search organization. No government funding, no fancy equipment warehouses, no big command center. What they had, though, was something much more elusive. Heart-real, human heart. Their divers, sonar techs, retired officers, even people who'd lost loved ones themselves, all pitched in and volunteered their time, often paying out of pocket. Traveling the country, searching rivers, lakes, quarries, anywhere a car could disappear without a trace. And their track record, impressive. with over 30 submerged vehicles located tied to missing persons in the last 5 years. Some were accidents, some were intentional, and some, like Katie's case, would turn out to hide a much darker story. In early September 2023, the team rolled into Ohio. They set up near the Route 7 bridge, launching their small boat onto the murky water. The Ohio River wasn't deep here, but it was dirty. Underwater visibility was basically zero. That's why the sonar mattered. The side scan equipment swept the riverbed, sending back ghostly images of everything below: rocks, old tires, pieces of metal. The usual forgotten junk. But they weren't looking for junk. They were searching for the silhouette of a mid-size SUV. On the afternoon of September 8th, something changed. "Hold on, I've got something," said the sonar operator. The tone changed. Everybody leaned in. On the screen, a big rectangular shape stood out from the riverbed. The dimensions lined up. It could be a car. They marked the GPS coordinates and dropped a buoy. Divers would go down the next morning with full daylight and the whole team ready. That evening, the phone rang again for Miguel. It was the team leader. "We found something," he said. "We can't confirm what it is yet, but the sonar reading is consistent with a vehicle. We're going down tomorrow to check it out." Miguel felt his stomach twist. After 23 years of waiting, this was the moment he'd always prayed for, and the moment he'd always feared. "Do you want to be there?" the team leader asked. Miguel said yes. Of course he did, but even then, he still didn't tell his mother, not until there was absolute certainty. After 23 years of false alarms and dead ends, he refused to put her through another heartbreak unless the truth was solid. The dive team suited up in the cool dawn air. The river appeared calm at the surface of the water, but everyone knew the water below told a different story. Cold, dark, and cloudy enough that you could barely see your own hand underwater. One by one, divers dropped in, following their coordinates, using their lights almost like fingertips, sweeping through the murk inch by inch. And then, one of them found it. A vehicle upright on all four wheels was coated in 2 decades of silt, algae, and river life. It sat eerily undisturbed, as if it had been placed there rather than thrown off a bridge. The diver signaled up to the surface. They cleared away mud and growth, looking for anything make, model, a logo, a plate, and then they saw it, the rear license plate. Faded, corroded, but still readable once they scraped it clean. The numbers coincided. It was Katie's CRV. Miguel was on shore when the diver surfaced and delivered the confirmation. He didn't cry. He didn't fall to his knees. He didn't shout. He just stood there, staring out at the water that had kept its secret for 23 long years. She had been right here, all this time. In less than an hour, the serene riverbank had transformed into a complete and utter crime scene. Police cars lined up along the edge of the water. Detectives, the coroner, and crime scene techs moved with deliberate focus. This wasn't a recovery anymore. This was evidence, possibly critical evidence. They called in to extract the car, but slowly and with care. A submerged car is fragile after so many years. One wrong move could destroy answers they'd waited decades for. Miguel finally called his mother. "Mom, they found her car." There was a long stretch of silence, and then a sound Miguel had never heard come from her, not in all the years of grief. A deep, aching wail that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest since December 2000. "Where?" she whispered. "The Ohio River, near the bridge." "Is she?" Miguel closed his eyes. "They haven't confirmed yet." "But Mom, they think so." Carmen didn't say a word. She just cried, and Miguel was left standing on the riverbank holding the phone, feeling his own heart crack open with hers. The crane arrived. Reporters hovered at the edges. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering to each other. It took hours of delicate maneuvering, but slowly the blue Honda CRV began to rise from the water. Mud streamed down its sides. Plants slipped away. The windows still intact. The doors still closed. And inside, barely visible through the grime, a shape, human remains. The coroner confirmed it straight away. The body lay in the driver's seat, skeletal but still draped in rags of clothes. A purse, a wallet, an ID card miraculously intact. 23 years at the bottom of a river, less than a mile from the porch light her mother had kept burning every night. By evening, the story was everywhere. The local news ran headlines. Reporters knocked on doors. People who had lived in the neighborhood back in 2000 shared memories with cameras rolling. But Carmen and Miguel kept their distance from the limelight. They went to the coroner's office, waiting for the official identification, waiting for answers they weren't so sure they wanted anymore. Because the car should have brought closure, but it felt off somehow. The CRV wasn't smashed, it wasn't flipped. It didn't look like a vehicle that hit the water at high speed. It looked placed, almost gently, and that raised a chilling question. How does a car end up in the river without anyone seeing, without anyone hearing, without being spotted in earlier searches? The forensic team got to work, documenting everything, collecting samples, going over every inch, and within 48 hours, they had their preliminary results. The discovery of the car wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new one, because Katie Hart hadn't died in an accident. The forensic examination progressed without delay. The car was taken directly to a secure facility, somewhere investigators could finally work without reporters hovering or cameras flashing. By this time, it was not only a recovery mission, it was a full-fledged crime scene, and every tiny detail suddenly mattered. Dr. Lisa Brennan, the county medical examiner, had seen just about everything in her 20 years on the job. Drownings, overdoses, homicides, suicides, bodies pulled from water, from fires, even from places most people couldn't imagine. But something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the 23-year timeline. Maybe it was the family, the mother who never stopped believing, the brother who refused to quit searching. Or maybe it was that quiet instinct seasoned investigators get when something simply doesn't add up. The remains were taken out of the vehicle in painstaking detail and then transported to the morgue. To the amazement of all, the skeleton was reasonably intact. More than would have been expected had been preserved by the cold river water in layers of silt. Clothing, although worn down, still left behind fragments. Denim, cotton, a jacket, even shoes on the feet. Dental records were requested from Katie's dentist, and within 24 hours the confirmation came back. No doubt, no hesitation. The remains were those of Katie Marie Hart's, but that answer would only open the door to deeper questions. Dr. Brennan began examining each bone, documenting, measuring, photographing, searching for any sign of trauma that might reveal what really happened to Katie all those years ago. And then she found it. Fracture on the back of the skull. Not a tiny crack, not the kind of damage you could put down to river pressure or the car shifting underwater. This was significant blunt force trauma, the kind of injury caused by a heavy object, the kind of injury that would knock someone unconscious or end their life in an instant. Still not satisfied, she called a forensic anthropologist, Dr. Marcus Reed. Decades into his career, with numerous courtroom testimonies to his name, he could tell the difference between injuries that happened before death and damage that occurred after. He examined the fracture under magnification, examining the edges, the pattern, the placement. His conclusion was firm and unmistakable. The injury happened at or near the time of death. This wasn't post-mortem damage. Someone had struck Katie in the back of the head, and the discoveries didn't stop there. While processing the vehicle, investigators found something that sent a chill straight through the room: the seatbelt. Katie had been wearing it. The way her remains sat made that clear, but the belt itself had been cut. Not torn, not frayed, but cut cleanly and deliberately. Under the microscope, the edges showed a clean slice consistent with a sharp blade, a knife. And that raised a terrifying question. Why would someone cut a seatbelt? A theory took shape. Katie had been struck, knocked out, or killed. Someone then drove her car to the bridge and sent it into the Ohio River. But if she was still buckled in, investigators might eventually find her strapped in place, and that could raise questions the killer didn't want asked. She had cut the seatbelt so that she would go down with the car, tangled inside, hidden by the river for as long as fate allowed. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad weather or a wrong turn on a snowy night. This was intentional, calculated, cold. Lieutenant Sarah Kovach was the lead detective. She'd worked homicides for 15 years, but never anything like this. A murder buried for over 2 decades, with a killer who walked free while the family lived every single day without answers. Lieutenant Kovac ushered Carmen and Miguel into a quiet station room. She spoke quietly, didn't rush, and above all, didn't sugarcoat. She merely told them what the evidence revealed. Carmen didn't speak, just stared at the tabletop, her hands clutched tightly together. Miguel was the one who finally asked the question that was burning in both their minds. Who did this? Kovac took a steady breath. We don't know yet, but we're going to find out. With that, the case was officially reclassified. What had once been a missing person report was now a homicide. What had been a dusty cold case was suddenly an active investigation, and every resource the department had was being redirected toward one goal. Who killed Katie Hart? Investigators went straight back to the beginning. They reviewed every interview from the year 2000, every statement, every alibi, every name connected to Katie during the days leading up to her disappearance. Fresh eyes, new evidence, and a new understanding changed how those old words looked. They pulled phone records from December of 2000, digging them out of long-buried archives. In this era, cell data wasn't as detailed as it is today. No GPS pings, no text logs, but there were still clues. Little digital breadcrumbs. Katie's phone had last pinged off a cell tower near the Route 7 bridge at 10:26 p.m. on December 15. That matched up with the timeline of the grainy traffic footage. But what investigators wanted to know was something far more important. What other phones were hitting that same tower around that same time? It felt like a long shot. After 23 years, most old records had been purged. Some carriers didn't even exist anymore. But they tried, and somehow they struck gold. One major carrier still had archived tower data. It took weeks to sort through it, cross-referencing, mapping, eliminating numbers that went nowhere. Most belonged to accounts long closed, but a few stood out, especially one number that hit the tower at 10:31 p.m., again at 10:47, and again at 11:03. That phone stayed in the neighborhood for over half an hour, moving, stopping, moving again. Investigators tracked the number. It was not easy. The account changed hands over the years, and the billing information was a mess. But eventually the name surfaced. Richard Hale, Katie's neighbor, the man who joined the search parties, the man who comforted Carmen when the worry became too much, the man who'd told police, clearly, that he'd been home all night on December 15th. He hadn't been. Lieutenant Kovac felt her heart quicken. This was it, the thread they'd been waiting for. But phone records from decades ago weren't enough. They needed something solid, something that would hold up in court, something that tied Richard not just to the bridge, but to the crime. They made their decision. On September 11th, 2023, investigators arrived at Richard Hale's house on Snow Road with a search warrant. He answered the door looking puzzled, squinting like he genuinely didn't understand why they were there. "We need to search your property, Mr. Hale. We have a warrant." He didn't fight, didn't ask for a lawyer right then and there. He just stepped aside and let the officers in. Maybe he thought the years had washed it away. Maybe he had convinced himself 23 years was long enough to cover his tracks. Maybe he really believed he outlived the truth. He hadn't. The search went on for hours. Investigators went through closets, drawers, the attic, the basement, every inch that might conceal something associated with Katie or that night near the bridge. And then they found it. In the basement, in a cardboard box buried behind old holiday decorations and forgotten odds and ends, was a simple folding knife. Nothing dramatic, just a regular pocket knife with a 3-inch blade, the kind millions of people carry. But this knife had secrets. Back at the lab, forensic analysts studied it under magnification. In the tiny grooves near the hinge, places too tight to fully clean, they found microscopic fibers, synthetic fibers, the kind used in seatbelt material. They compared them with samples taken from Katie's car. The weave, the dye, the composition, they all matched. The knife was no longer just a knife, it was proof. The knife wasn't just suspicious anymore. It was the tool that had cut Katie's seatbelt. When Lieutenant Kovac read the final forensic report, she felt a cold, steady anger rise inside her. This wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't guesswork. Richard Hale had killed Katie Hart. He'd struck her in the head. He'd driven her car to the bridge. He'd rolled it into the river. He'd cut her seatbelt to make sure she never came back up. And then he'd walked back to his house, just 3 doors down from Carmen, and played the helpful neighbor for the next 23 years, bringing casseroles, offering sympathy, acting like he cared. But there was still one more thing investigators needed: DNA. This car had been submerged for more than 2 decades, but forensic science is stubborn. There's even a trace of biological material, and it wants to talk. Technicians swabbed the steering wheel, the door handles, the gear shift, any surface that might have been touched by the driver. They found touch DNA, partial, male, not enough for a full profile, but enough to compare. They asked Richard for a DNA sample. He refused, which he had every right to do. But at this stage, the police had more than suspicion. They had probable cause. A judge signed the order, and Richard was compelled to provide the sample. Results came back 2 days later. A match. Richard Hale's DNA was inside Katie's car. With that, the case tightened like a vice. Phone records place him near the bridge at the exact time Katie vanished. A knife with matching seatbelt fibers sat hidden in his basement. His DNA was on the steering wheel and the door handle. A blow from a heavy object was found on Katie's skull. The cut seatbelt showed that she had been deliberately staged to stay submerged. But even with all that, Lieutenant Kovacs wasn't done. She wanted the whole truth, the motive, the reason behind the cruelty. What makes a man kill his neighbor's daughter and then live a friendly, quiet life in the same neighborhood for more than 2 decades? So the team went back to the original files from 2000. They combed through every statement like it was brand new. And then they found a small detail, almost a throwaway line, in an interview with one of Katie's coworkers. At a summer '99 barbecue, Katie had seemed uncomfortable. She confided in a coworker that one of her mom's neighbors was a little too friendly. She didn't name him, and the coworker didn't push. At the time, it sounded like harmless small talk. But now it was a blinking red light. Kovacs called Miguel. She asked if Katie had ever said anything about Richard, anything unusual, anything alarming. Miguel went quiet, really quiet, and then he remembered, late 1999. Katie had come over for Sunday dinner. After the meal, she pulled Miguel aside, told him Richard Hale had been making her uncomfortable. At first, she'd brushed it off. Snow Road was small, people bumped into each other. But this wasn't bumping into someone. This was showing up places she was, repeatedly. The grocery store, the gas station, her favorite coffee shop. And every time he pushed a little more. Compliments, questions. Maybe we could get dinner. Katie let him down easy. She didn't want to cause a problem with her mom. She stayed polite, friendly, respectful, but Richard didn't take the hint. One night in the grocery store parking lot, he leaned into her car window before she could roll it up, told her they'd be good together, told her she just needed to give him a chance. This time, Katie didn't hesitate. She told him no, firmly, told him to stop, told him he was making her uncomfortable. Richard retreated, apologized, and for a time seemed to vanish from her everyday life. Katie truly believed it was over. It wasn't. Katie had told Miguel about the incident, but she also asked him not to mention it to their mom. Carmen already had enough on her plate, and Katie didn't want to stir up neighborhood drama over something she believed was handled. Miguel agreed, and like so many things that feel urgent in the moment, it eventually slipped to the back of his mind. Then Katie disappeared. In the panic, the chaos, the sleepless nights that followed, that conversation simply vanished under the weight of everything else. But sitting in the police station all these years later, telling Lieutenant Kovacs what he remembered, Miguel felt sick. The guilt hit him hard. If he'd told his mom, if he'd warned someone, if he'd confronted Hale, maybe, just maybe, Katie would still be alive. Lieutenant Kovacs saw it on his face before he had gotten the words out. She leaned in gently and cut him off. "This is not your fault. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. The only person responsible for what happened to Katie is Richard Hale." Miguel nodded, but deep inside, he wasn't so sure he would ever believe that. Still, motive was coming into focus. Hale had been interested in Katie. She'd rejected him. And for a man like him, someone used to slipping under the radar, someone who survived on patience and persistence, that rejection didn't fade. It festered. Investigators dug deeper into Hale's past. They spoke with people who had known him over the years and combed through old records. Slowly, a disturbing pattern took shape. Richard Hale wasn't a man with much of a personal life. No wife. No long-term partners anyone could recall. He kept mostly to himself. Polite but distant. He worked at a manufacturing plant, showed up on time, did the work, went home. Co-workers described him as the kind of man you forget about the moment he walks away. Still, a few things stood out. A former co-worker remembered Hale talking about a woman he liked back in the late 90s. He'd been obsessed, absolutely convinced she was perfect for him. The problem? She wasn't interested. And when the co-worker asked how Hale was handling the rejection, he remembered Hale going quiet, cold, saying something like, "She'll regret it. They always do." At the time, it sounded like a bitter guy with a bruised ego, but now it sounded a lot darker. Another of the older neighbors, a woman who had lived on Snow Road before relocating, remembered Hale always around the neighborhood's young women. Nothing overtly inappropriate, just always there, always watching, always offering help nobody really asked for. She'd written it off to loneliness. Now she wasn't so sure. The psychological picture was forming. A man who was entitled. A man who didn't handle rejection well. A man able to stew in resentment for a long, long time. And a man patient enough to wait for the moment he wanted. December 15th, 2000. A blizzard. Terrible roads. Katie driving home alone. Investigators believe that Hale had been watching her. Perhaps he followed her from the grocery store. Perhaps he was waiting near the bridge. Either way, he intercepted her that night. Maybe he flagged her down, acting like he needed help. Katie was kind enough to stop. Or perhaps he made her stop, blocking her way with his own car. Whatever the precise scenario, the conclusion was the same. He hit her. The blow to the back of her head showed she never saw it coming. Maybe she turned away. Maybe she was trying to get back inside her car. However it happened, the damage was sufficient to knock her unconscious or kill her outright. After that, he staged everything. He put her in the driver's seat, drove her car to the bridge, rolled it into the river, and when the seatbelt complicated his plan, he cut it. He made sure the river would take her and keep his secret. Then he drove home, washed up, changed clothes, and the next morning when the search began, he stepped right in, comforted the family, helped hang flyers, played the role of the worried neighbor. He lived with what he did and almost got away with it for 23 years. But technology had caught up. Sonar had caught up. Forensics had caught up. A volunteer dive team pulled Katie's car from the river, carrying the truth Richard Hale never expected to face. Lieutenant Kovacs and her team collated everything, every report, every lab result, every interview, and presented the complete case package to the district attorney. The DA went through it piece by piece. The phone records, the DNA findings, the knife, the fiber analysis, the skull fracture, the cut seat belt, and the emerging motive. When the arrest warrant for Richard Hale was signed, Snow Road felt the repercussions immediately. Neighbors who had known him for years were in shock. For investigators, though, the arrest was only the beginning. Kovacs knew the precariousness of justice. To arrest someone was one thing. To secure a conviction, quite another. A good defense attorney could tear down most anything that was not ironclad. She pushed her team to cinch down every detail. Every piece of evidence had to tell the same story and hold up to the toughest questions a courtroom could toss its way. The DNA evidence was especially important. It was touch DNA, the kind recovered from surfaces people handle, not the more obvious biological samples. On the steering wheel, the door handle, and the gear shift, small collections of skin cells had survived more than 2 decades underwater. And while touch DNA is powerful, it's also the sort of evidence defense attorneys love to challenge. Contamination, transfer, innocent contact. Those arguments can create doubt in a jury's mind. That's where Dr. Raymond Foster came in. Foster had been a forensic DNA specialist for 15 years, and he knew exactly how to prepare evidence so it could stand firm under cross-examination. He ran the samples through the lab's extraction and amplification process, one slow step at a time. These yielded a partial but solid male profile, enough markers to do a real comparison. When Hale's court-ordered DNA sample arrived, Foster processed it the same way. Then he compared the profiles. 13 matching markers. Statistically, the odds of the DNA on Katie's steering wheel belonging to anyone but Richard Hale were about 1 in 7 billion. In practical terms, it was a direct hit. Still, Foster knew that wasn't the end of it. A defense team might argue that Hale could have touched Katie's car weeks or months earlier. So investigators checked with Carmen and Miguel. They asked if Hale had ever been inside Katie's vehicle for any reason to help with repairs, borrow something, or offer a ride. The answer was immediate and absolute. No. Katie had avoided him. He was never inside her car. That removed any credible innocent explanation. But DNA wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. The phone records told their own story. Hale had originally told police he was home the entire night of December 15th, watching television before going to bed around 11. That statement fell apart instantly when investigators pulled his phone data. His cell had pinged off the tower near the Route 7 bridge several times between 10:31 and 11:03 p.m., precisely when Katie disappeared. He had placed himself at the scene without realizing it. Then there was the knife found in his basement. Forensic testing revealed microscopic fibers lodged in its hinge. Those fibers matched the material of Katie's seatbelt, the weave, the synthetic makeup, the color. Defense attorneys might argue that many cars use similar materials, but investigators didn't stop there. They compared the cut on the actual seatbelt with test cuts made using Hale's knife. The angle and depth were consistent. Not a perfect one-to-one match. That's impossible after decades, but close enough for an expert to confidently say it aligned with the characteristics of that specific blade. And finally, the medical evidence. The fracture in the back of Katie's skull wasn't a byproduct of the car entering the river. Dr. Brennan had been clear. It was a per mortem injury, one delivered at or very near the time she was killed. Someone had struck her from behind unexpectedly and with enough force to cause catastrophic damage. Individually, each piece was riveting, but taken together, DNA, phone records, the knife, the seatbelt fibers, the blunt force trauma, they formed a narrative that was nearly impossible to refute. The story wasn't just strong, it was airtight. And for the first time in more than 2 decades, justice was finally within reach. The injury to the back of Katie's head told investigators almost everything they needed to know. A single devastating blow, one that would have rendered her unconscious immediately, possibly killed her outright. The placement mattered. It was behind her, where she couldn't see it coming. She had been ambushed. From there, the prosecution's theory took shape. On the night of December 15th, 2000, in the middle of a blizzard, Richard Hale had found a way to stop Katie. Maybe by flagging her down, maybe by forcing her to pull over. However he managed it, he got close enough to strike her from behind with something heavy. Investigators never found the exact weapon, but it didn't need to be complicated. A tire iron, a wrench, a steel pipe. Any blunt object could have caused that fracture. He had put her in the driver's seat of her own car, drove it onto the bridge, and rolled it into the Ohio River. But before he did that, he had cut the seatbelt, ensuring she would sink with the vehicle, ensuring his secret would stay hidden. The evidence all pointed to that sequence, but prosecutors also knew jurors look for motive. They want to understand why would a man kill the daughter of his neighbor? What set it off? That's where Miguel's testimony became crucial. He would tell the jury about the conversation he'd had with Katie back in 1999, about Hale's unwanted attention, her discomfort, and the way she tried to avoid him afterward. It painted a clear picture of a man who did not handle rejection well, a man who felt entitled to attention he hadn't earned, a man who waited patiently for the moment when circumstances allowed him to act. And he took a chance in that snowstorm with Katie being alone. District Attorney Margaret Lawson studied the case file in the quiet of her office. She'd been a prosecutor for 2 decades, long enough to see what people were capable of, but this case got under her skin. Maybe it was the length of time, 23 years of a family living with questions while the man responsible lived just 3 doors down. Maybe it was the cold, deliberate act of cutting the seatbelt. Maybe it was picturing him joining search parties, comforting Carmen, pretending to care. Or perhaps it was just the injustice of all those years lost. Lawson approved the charges: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. Taken together, they carried the possibility of life without parole. Richard Hale was arraigned on September 14th, 2023. He entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, wrist cuffed in front of him. The room was filled. Neighbors, reporters, people who had known Katie, and people who had known Hale. Carmen and Miguel sat in the front row. Carmen seemed smaller, more fragile, but her eyes were steady. She stared at the man who had taken her daughter's life, the same man who had once stood on her porch, telling her not to give up hope. She didn't look away. The judge read the charges and asked for a plea. Hale's attorney, public defender Thomas Brennan, rose to his feet. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words hung in the air, as if the DNA wasn't there, as if the phone records weren't there, as if the fibers and the cut seatbelt and the skull fracture were all a product of imagination. But that was how the system worked. Every defendant deserved a defense. Every case had to be proven. The judge denied bail. Too serious. Too much risk of flight. Hale would stay behind bars until trial. As deputies let him out, Hale turned once, his eyes locking onto Carmen's. For one instant, something flickered across his face. Not remorse, not regret. Something colder. Something which confirmed what she had always feared. But Carmen did not flinch. She held her gaze. Because after 23 long years, finally she had answers. And she was determined to see justice carried through to the very end. 2 days earlier, on the morning of September 12th, Snow Road had awakened to the undramatic cadence of daily life. Coffee brewing, kids at the bus stops, neighbors firing up their day. A placid, unremarkable Tuesday. Then at 6:47 a.m., 4 patrol cars entered the street in formation and stopped the pretense of normalcy. There were no flashing lights, no blaring sirens, just the low, steady hum of engines rolling down Snow Road and the crunch of tires on the pavement. The patrol cars came to a stop in front of Richard Hale's house. Doors opened. Officers stepped out one by one. Lieutenant Kovacs was there, along with 2 major crimes detectives and a uniformed officer whose body camera captured every second. Neighbors noticed right away. Mrs. Patterson had just picked up her morning newspaper across the street. She froze mid-step, her hand still outstretched, the paper dangling loosely as she stared. Mr. Delgado was 2 houses down, loading his truck in preparation for work. He set aside his toolbox and watched in silence. Lieutenant Kovacs reached the door and knocked. 3 firm, deliberate knocks. 15 seconds passed, then 30. Finally, the door opened. Richard Hale stood in the doorway, wearing sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. His hair was rumpled from his sleep. His glasses slid down his nose. His eyes moved from the officers to the patrol cars, confusion crossing his face. "Can I help you?" he asked. Lieutenant Kovacs kept her voice even, professional. "Richard Hale, you are under arrest for the murder of Katie Marie Hart." For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Hale's face. Surprise, fear, recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by an expression as blank and controlled as a closed door. "I don't understand," he said, but his tone was too calm, too measured. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." He did. No argument, no struggle, no request for a lawyer. He merely turned, extended his wrists, and let them cuff him. The arresting officer read him his rights, each line steady and clear. "Do you understand these rights?" "Yes," Hale said. That single word. No denial, no outrage, just acquiescence. They walked him down the steps, across the lawn toward the patrol car. By then, the whole street was aware something was going on. Neighbors stepped outside, some in pajamas, others holding mugs of coffee, children clinging to their parents' arms asking what was happening. They watched from porches and driveways as quiet, unobtrusive, helpful Richard Hale, that Richard, was put into the back seat of a police cruiser. Mrs. Patterson dropped her newspaper onto the sidewalk. Mr. Delgado raised his phone and began recording. Someone down the street called a neighbor who had already left for work. Within minutes, texts and calls spread quicker than the morning sun. "They just arrested Richard Hale." "For what?" "Murder." "Whose murder?" "Katie Hart's." "That was over 20 years ago." "I'm telling you, I saw it myself." 3 doors down, Carmen Hart's had been awake since 5. For Carmen, sleep had become a distant memory. These days had also been the worst, enduring the wait for answers, yet dreading them too. Katie's car had been found. Her remains were being examined. The truth was on its way, but Carmen did not have any idea what it would look like. She sat at her kitchen table, her hands clasped around a mug of tea that had gone cold when she heard the engines outside. She walked to the window, pulled back the curtain, and there he was, Richard Hale, handcuffed, being led to a police car, her knees almost buckled. She clung to the counter to hold herself up. Miguel had warned her the night before, told her an arrest was imminent, told her it was someone close, someone they knew. But she could not bring herself to believe it was Hale. Not the man who helped search for Katie. Not the man who brought casseroles when she couldn't make herself cook. Not the man who for years had checked in on her, always saying he prayed for answers. Not him, but it was him. Carmen watched through the window until the patrol cars started to pull away. Then she did something she hadn't done since December 15th, 2000. She walked to the front door and reached for the switch controlling the porch light. The light that had stayed on every night for 23 years. The light that had become a symbol, a ritual, a promise. Finally, Carmen turned off the porch light. Not because she'd given up, but because she didn't need it anymore. Katie wasn't missing. She had been found, and the man who'd taken her was finally facing justice. About 20 minutes later, Miguel pulled up. He'd raced there the instant Lieutenant Kovac called and said, "It's done." We arrested him. Miguel had broken just about every speed limit on the way over, heart thudding, not knowing in what state he'd find his mother. Carmen was sitting on the couch, staring directly ahead, lost somewhere far away in her thoughts. Miguel sat beside her, silent, and gently put his arm around her shoulders. "He was right there," she whispered. "All this time. Right there." Miguel nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. "He looked me in the eye, Miguel. Over and over again. He told me not to lose hope. He told me he was praying for us." Her voice cracked, not from sadness, but from a deep, burning anger. "And he knew. He knew the whole time." She took a shaky breath. "I want to see him. I want to look him in the eye and ask him why." Miguel tightened his arm around her. "You will, Mom. At the trial, you'll get your chance." By mid-morning, the neighborhood was abuzz with chaos. News vans rolled in. Reporters knocked on doors. Everyone wanted to know the same things. What did people know about Richard Hale? Had anyone seen any signs? Had anyone suspected him? Most neighbors didn't want to talk. They were stunned, confused, angry. This wasn't a stranger passing through town. This wasn't some shadowy figure nobody knew. This was Richard, a man who'd lived among them for decades, a man they'd waved to while picking up the mail, a man who kept his lawn tidy and made polite conversation. How do you even begin to process that? Some neighbors refused to believe it. There's no way. Richard? Number. They must have made a mistake. They clung to that because the alternative was too unsettling. If Richard could be a killer, then who couldn't? Others started recalling little things, odd moments that didn't make sense at the time. How he always seemed to be around when something happened. How he watched people a little too closely. How he had a habit of showing up in situations where he didn't exactly belong. His preliminary hearing was scheduled for October 3rd, 2023, 3 weeks since the arrest. 3 weeks for prosecutors to get their evidence in order. 3 weeks for the defense to devise its strategy. 3 weeks for Snow Road to come to terms with the unimaginable. The courthouse was filled that morning for the hearing, and every seat was taken. Reporters lined the back wall with notebooks and cameras, waiting for their first look at Hale. Carmen and Miguel sat in the front row behind the prosecution. Carmen wore black. She'd worn nothing but black since the day Katie's car was pulled from the river. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose as Judge Patricia Moreland entered. She was in her late 50s, gray hair pulled tight into a bun, glasses hanging from a chain. Someone who looked like she'd seen it all and didn't have patience for courtroom theatrics. With that, everyone sat down, and then the side door opened, bringing in Richard Hale. He looked different, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks brought by his attorney. From a distance, he looked like someone's accountant, someone's quiet uncle, not a man accused of murder. Carmen's hands clenched together. Miguel reached over and squeezed her fingers. She never turned her eyes away from Hale. He sat down beside his attorney, Thomas Brennan, a worn public defender in his 40s, who had represented a lot of people accused of horrible things, and he knew this case was going to be a steep climb. Judge Moreland looked over at the prosecution. "Ms. Lawson, you may proceed." District Attorney Margaret Lawson stood. Tall, composed, steady, she carried herself like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Your Honor," she began, "the state intends to prove that on December 15th, 2000, the defendant, Richard Hale, murdered Katie Marie Hart. That he struck her with a blunt object, causing a fatal skull fracture. That he placed her body in her own vehicle and drove it to the Route 7 bridge, where he pushed it into the Ohio River. That he cut her seatbelt to ensure her body stayed submerged with the car. And that for 23 years he lived just down the street from her family while hiding what he had done." Margaret Lawson stopped there, letting the weight of it sit with the room. "The evidence will show," she continued, "that the defendant's DNA was found on the steering wheel and door handle of the victim's car. That his cell phone records place him at the scene at the time of the crime. That a knife recovered from his home contains fibers matching the victim's seatbelt, and that Mr. Hale made unwanted advances toward the victim in the months before her death. Advances she rejected." She turned a little, looking at Hale. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He sat there with his hands folded, his face blank, like he was listening to someone read a grocery list instead of a murder accusation. "This was not an accident, Your Honor," Lawson said. "This was murder, planned, deliberate, and hidden for over 2 decades. The state asks that the defendant be bound over for trial." She sat down. Judge Moreland turned her attention to the defense. "Mr. Brennan." Thomas Brennan rose to his feet. He looked tired, like a man who had been up half the night preparing for an argument he knew he probably wouldn't win. "Your Honor," he began, "the defense acknowledges the tragic loss of Miss Hart's and the immense pain suffered by her family. But the prosecution's case relies heavily on circumstantial evidence and assumptions." He gestured toward Hale. "DNA transfer can occur in completely innocent ways. Mr. Hale lived in the same neighborhood. Incidental contact with the victim or her vehicle is completely possible. Cell phone records from 23 years ago are far from precise, and fibers on a common pocket knife prove nothing." He straightened his notes. "My client has lived in his community for over 30 years. No criminal history, no violence, no prior accusations. The prosecution wants the court to believe a man with no history of violent behavior suddenly committed a brutal murder and hid it perfectly for more than 20 years. Respectfully, Your Honor, that stretches credibility." He sat. It wasn't a powerful argument, and he knew it, but it was the only angle he had. Judge Moreland made a few notes. "The court will hear evidence. Miss Lawson, call your first witness. The state calls Dr. Lisa Brennan, County Medical Examiner." Dr. Brennan was sworn in and took the stand. Lawson stepped forward. "Dr. Brennan, you performed the autopsy on the remains recovered from the vehicle pulled from the Ohio River on September 10th, 2023, correct?" "Correct." "And you identified the remains as Katie Marie Hart's?" "Yes, through dental records." "And what were your findings regarding the cause of death?" Dr. Brennan opened her file. "The remains demonstrated a depressed skull fracture at the rear of the head injury, compatible with having been struck by a heavy object. This blow would have caused immediate unconsciousness and was likely fatal. In your professional opinion, could this injury have come from the car entering the water?" "No, the pattern doesn't match that. This was a direct, focused impact, not the kind of injury caused by a vehicle hitting water." "So this was an intentional act of violence?" "Yes." Lawson nodded. "Thank you, Dr. Brennan." Thomas Brennan stood up to cross-examine. "Dr. Brennan, could it be that the injury occurred after death?" "Post-mortem injuries show different characteristics," she said, "but I cannot say with absolute certainty. The evidence strongly suggests the injury occurred before or at the time she entered the water. But no, I can't state that with 100% certainty." A small opening. Brennan took it. "No further questions." The prosecution then called the next witness, Detective Raymond Cole, one of the investigators who processed the vehicle. "Detective Cole," Lawson said, "can you describe what you found when you examined the victim's seatbelt?" "The seatbelt had been cut clean." "The cut was clean," Detective Cole explained. consistent with a sharp blade, most likely a knife. And what does that tell you? Lawson asked. It suggests that somebody deliberately cut the seatbelt after the victim was placed in the car, possibly to make sure the body stayed submerged. Thank you, Detective. Brennan stood for cross-examination. Could the seatbelt have been cut by rescue crews during an earlier search, Detective? There were no rescue attempts involving the vehicle, Cole said. The car wasn't found until 2023. But you can't rule out every possible explanation, can you? Cole sighed. No, I can't rule out every hypothetical. Another minor fissure in the case for the defense, but the wall of evidence was continuing to grow higher. Next to testify was DNA specialist Dr. Raymond Foster. Dr. Foster, Lawson began, can you explain to us the DNA recovered from the victim's vehicle? We found touch DNA on the steering wheel and the driver's side door handle, he said. The profile matches the defendant, Richard Hale. The chance of it belonging to anyone else is about 1 in 7 billion. Is there any innocent explanation for Mr. Hale's DNA being in those spots? Finally, Judge Moreland called for closing arguments. Margaret Lawson rose. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. DNA, phone records, physical findings, and motive. The defendant murdered Katie Hart, and the proof is beyond any reasonable doubt. The state asks that he be bound over for trial. Thomas Brennan stood. Your Honor, the prosecution has a theory, but theories aren't proof. Circumstantial evidence is not proof. My client deserves a fair trial, and the defense will show there are reasonable explanations for each piece of evidence you've heard today. Judge Moreland took off her glasses, rubbed her eyes, and then peered directly at Hale. Mr. Hale, please rise. He got up slowly. Brennan was standing beside him. Based upon the evidence presented to this court, probable cause is found to exist to believe that a crime was committed and that you have committed it. You are hereby bound over for trial. A date will be set within 60 days. Bail is denied. You will remain in custody. Her gavel came down with a sharp thud. Carmen exhaled, long and shaky. It wasn't justice yet, but it was a first real step in that direction. Outside the courthouse was a circus. Reporters, cameras, lights. It felt like every news outlet in the country had shown up. Miguel slipped his arm around his mother to shield her as they pushed through the crowd. Officers cleared a narrow path, but halfway down the steps, Carmen stopped. She spun around to face the sea of cameras. Miguel whispered, Mom, you don't have to do this. Yes, she said softly, I do. She stepped forward. The crowd hushed. A wall of microphones leaned toward her. For 23 years, Carmen began, her voice steady, I didn't know what happened to my daughter. For 23 years, I kept a light on every night, hoping she'd find her way home. And for 23 years, the man who killed her lived 3 doors down. Her voice quavered, but she didn't back away. He looked me in the eye. He told me not to give up hope. He pretended to care. And all that time, he knew exactly where Katie was. He knew what he'd done, and he let us suffer. She gauged it, her shoulders squared. But today, we're one step closer to justice. And I want to make it clear, this family won't stop. We'll be here for every hearing, every motion, every day of that trial. We will make sure Katie's voice is heard, her story is told, and Richard Hale is held accountable. A reporter called out, Mrs. Hartz, do you think you'll ever find closure? Carmen shook her head. Closure is a word people use when they don't know what else to say. There's no closure when you lose a child. There's no moving on. There's only justice. And that's what we're fighting for. Another reporter tried, what would you say to Richard Hale if you had the chance? Carmen's eyes hardened. I'd ask him why. Why Katie? What did she ever do to deserve what he did to her? But I don't think he'd answer. I don't think he's capable of telling the truth. So instead I'll say this. You took my daughter. You took 23 years of my life. But you will not take my fight. You will not take my voice. And you will not walk away from this. Miguel steered her gently away. They got into a waiting car. As the car pulled from the curb, Carmen leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes. You did good, Mom, Miguel said softly. She didn't speak, just reached over and took his hand. But something was different on Snow Road. The porch light, on every single night for over 20 years, was off. Where it used to be, though, something else had appeared. Neighbors had begun leaving flowers, candles, notes of support. "We're with you, Carmen." Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes continued to collect on the Hart's family porch. Messages of support, sympathy, and outrage. Justice for Katie. We'll never forget. Carmen stood there silent, taking it all in. Miguel stepped up beside her. He spoke softly. "People care." "They should have cared 23 years ago," Carmen replied, not in anger, just weariness. Inside, the house was strangely still. Carmen walked to Katie's room, a door she hadn't opened since the day the car was found. When she pushed it open, everything was just as it had been. The bed neatly made, the photographs on the dresser, the clothes hanging in the closet. But it was all different now because the uncertainty was gone. The wondering, the hoping, the torturous what-ifs. Now they knew. Carmen sat on the edge of the bed and picked up a framed photo. Katie at her college graduation, smiling, bright-eyed, full of plans she'd never get to live. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Miguel appeared in the doorway, then walked over and sat beside her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just sat in the quiet of a room frozen in time. After a long moment, Carmen stood. She straightened her back and wiped her eyes. "We have work to do," she said. Miguel turned. "What do you mean?" "The trial. I want to know everything, every witness, every piece of evidence, every argument. I want to be ready." Miguel nodded. "Okay, we'll be ready." Carmen set the photo back on the nightstand. "Justice for Katie," she said quietly. "Justice for Katie," said Miguel. The porch light might be off for the first time in decades, but the fight was only just beginning. Carmen had waited 23 long years. She could wait a little longer, but for Richard Hale, the clock was finally running out. Katie Hart's case is one that stays with you, not only because of the violence she suffered, and not only because her family spent more than 2 decades in painful uncertainty. What makes this case so haunting is who committed the crime. Richard Hale wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some nameless drifter. He was a neighbor, a familiar face, someone the community trusted. And that forces a hard truth into focus. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who hide in plain sight. For more than 20 years, Hale lived an ordinary life. He went to work, mowed his lawn, chatted with neighbors. He stood shoulder to shoulder with volunteers searching for the woman he knew would never be found alive. He watched Carmen keep that porch light on. He watched Miguel cling to hope. He watched as a family broke under the weight of not knowing. And he said nothing. A coldness of that variety, calculated, patient, unflinching, is incomprehensible but very real. And a sober reminder. Evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the man across the street waving at you. Katie's story is also a powerful example of why one never gives up. Carmen and Miguel could have bought into the official theory from 2000 that Katie had an accident during the blizzard, and her car simply disappeared under the ice. They could have tried to move on, but they didn't. They continued to look. They kept asking questions. They wouldn't let the world forget her. Because of that persistence, combined with new technology and a volunteer dive team who refused to let cold mean closed, Katie was found, and her killer was exposed. The trial is still to come. Hale has pleaded not guilty and will have his day in court. The defense will do what defense attorneys do: question the science, highlight uncertainties, argue alternative explanations. That's the legal system. But the evidence is strong. The DNA, the phone records, the knife, the seatbelt, fracture of the skull, the motive, it all points in one direction, and Carmen and Miguel will be there, day in and day out, to make sure Katie's voice is heard, her story is not forgotten, and justice is demanded. This case, too, is a reminder of just how far forensic technology has come. Touch DNA, digital phone records, advanced sonar imaging. Tools that barely existed in 2000 are now strong enough to break a 23-year-old mystery wide open. There are thousands of cold cases across the country, thousands of families still waiting, keeping porch lights on, holding on to hope that someone, someday, will find the truth. Stories like Katie's give them that hope. If this story moved you, share it. Share in honor of Katie. Share so other families know they are not alone. Share so forgotten cases don't remain forgotten. And if this is your first time here, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment, since every bit of interaction keeps these stories alive, and that matters a lot. Before we wrap up, I'd like to hear from you. Should there be no statute of limitations regarding murder cases? Should more resources be put into solving cold cases? Should volunteer search organizations like the team that found Katie receive more support? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Katie Hart was only 25 years old. She had dreams, ambition, a future, all of it taken in just that one moment of violence. But her story doesn't end in that river. It continues in a courtroom where the evidence will speak for her and where her family will be fighting in her name for justice. The porch light on Snow Road is dark now, but the fight for Katie burns brighter than ever. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And please stay safe, because we don't always know who's living 3 doors down. See you in the next one.